The moment that handbag appeared in Paris, everything changed. Not quietly, not politely, but like a silent detonation that didn't make noise, yet shook every corridor of power, from palace walls to fashion boardrooms. Because this was never just about a bag. This was about control, about access, about who was allowed inside the system and who is suddenly locked out. And what no one expected, what no one saw coming, was the speed, the precision, the almost surgical calm with which Princess Anne and Zara Tindall allegedly moved behind the scenes, not reacting but containing, because insiders are now whispering something far more explosive than the scandal itself, that this wasn't chaos, this was coordination. And it started the moment that custom-commissioned handbag, the one that was never meant to leave a secured London showroom, somehow ended up in the hands of Meghan Markle, walking through Paris as if nothing was wrong, as if the system hadn't just been bypassed. But inside those systems, alarm bells were already ringing. Because in the world of high fashion, the real world, not the Instagram version, provenance is everything. You don't just wear a piece, you are authorized to wear it. You are selected, approved, cleared. And when that chain breaks, it's not a mistake. It's a breach. And breaches don't get handled publicly. They get contained fast. And that's where things start to feel less like gossip and more like strategy. Because according to those watching closely, Princess Anne didn't react emotionally. There were no statements, no outrage, no visible tension. Just silence. Deliberate, heavy, calculated silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ignore a problem, it isolates it. While the headlines were still catching up, while speculation was still building, a different kind of movement had already begun behind closed doors. Phone calls that didn't leak, decisions that didn't get announced, doors that quietly but firmly stopped opening. And in the middle of it all stood Zara Tindall, the one whose name was attached to that bag, the one who could have turned this into a public storm but didn't. That wasn't restraint, that was positioning. Because instead of escalating, she withdrew. No interviews, no visible reaction, no emotional narrative, just distance. And in elite circles, distance is louder than confrontation. It signals one thing: this is being handled elsewhere. And suddenly, the narrative began shifting, not publicly, but structurally. Because while the world debated whether this was a misunderstanding, the industry didn't hesitate. Access tightened, requests slowed, approvals stalled. And if you look closely, you can see the pattern forming, the same pattern that insiders are now calling the quiet containment, a system where nothing is officially said, but everything changes. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. Because sources are now suggesting that what followed wasn't just industry reaction, it was alignment, a quiet understanding between institutions that rarely need to speak directly, because they already operate on the same rules. Discretion, control, hierarchy. And when one of those is challenged, the response is never chaotic. It's coordinated. Think about the timing. The bag appears. The whispers begin. And almost immediately, the ecosystem around Meghan Markle starts to thin out. Not collapse, not explode, just fade. Invitations become uncertain. Confirmations disappear. Associations become unofficial. And the most dangerous part? No one says why. Because they don't need to. In that world, silence isn't absence, it's judgment. And the more you look at it, the more it feels like this wasn't just about correcting a mistake, it was about preventing something from escalating further. Containing a narrative before it spiraled, containing access before it spread, containing influence before it reshaped the system itself. And if that's true, then the real story isn't what happened in Paris, it's what happened after. Because insiders are now quietly pointing to something far more strategic, that Princess Anne didn't just stay silent, she defined the silence. A silence that others followed, a silence that closed ranks, a silence that turned a scandal into a boundary. And in that boundary, roles became very clear. On one side, legacy, protocol, controlled access. On the other, unpredictability, visibility, disruption. And systems like this, they don't adapt to disruption. They neutralize it, which raises the question no one is answering out loud. Was this just a scandal? Or was this the moment the system decided it had seen enough? Because if you follow the trail, the bag, the access, the reaction, the silence, it doesn't feel accidental anymore. It feels managed, carefully, quietly, completely. And the most unsettling part, we're only seeing the surface. Because what's happening behind closed doors, what's being decided without headlines, that's where the real story is unfolding. And if the whispers are true, then what comes next isn't recovery, it's isolation. And that isolation didn't arrive like a storm, it settled in like a slow, invisible fog. The kind you don't notice at first, the kind that doesn't block your vision immediately, but gradually erases the edges of everything around you until you realize there's nowhere left to go. Because what insiders are now hinting at is something far more chilling than a public fallout, they're describing a controlled freeze, a deliberate slowing of access that didn't need announcements, didn't need headlines, didn't even need confrontation, because it was executed through the most powerful tool in elite systems, coordinated withdrawal. And this is where the alleged coordination between Princess Anne and Zara Tindall begins to feel less like coincidence and more like architecture, because suddenly everything that once flowed easily stopped flowing. Stylists who once competed quietly stepped back. Fashion houses that once entertained possibilities shifted into non-committal silence. PR channels that used to respond quickly slowed down, then disappeared altogether, not with rejection, but with absence. And absence in that world is final. What makes this even more unsettling is how clean it looks from the outside. There's no visible war, no explosive statements, no messy public fallout, just a gradual tightening, a narrowing of space until the system naturally pushes one figure further and further out without ever appearing aggressive. And that's exactly what makes it so effective, because it doesn't create sympathy, it creates confusion. Why are doors closing? Why are opportunities vanishing? Why does everything feel off? But behind that confusion, insiders suggest something much colder, that the handbag incident wasn't treated as a one-off mistake, but as confirmation of a pattern the system had already been watching, a pattern of bypassing, a pattern of forcing proximity, a pattern of creating the appearance of connection without the permission that connection requires. And in a world built entirely on permission, that's the one rule you don't break. So instead of reacting emotionally, instead of feeding the narrative, the response became structural, a recalibration of access, a tightening of protocols, a quiet agreement that certain lines once crossed don't get reopened. And here's where the story takes a darker turn, because whispers are now suggesting that the so-called containment wasn't just about preventing further incidents, it was about preventing influence from spreading in ways the system couldn't control. Think about that. If one breach can happen once, it can happen again. If one boundary can be crossed, others might follow. And suddenly, this isn't just about one handbag anymore. It becomes about protecting the integrity of an entire ecosystem, an ecosystem that doesn't tolerate unpredictability, especially not from someone operating outside its internal rules. So the response becomes preemptive, not reactive. And that's exactly what people are now seeing play out. A version of reality where everything still looks normal on the surface, appearances continue, public life continues, visibility remains, but underneath the machinery that once supported that visibility has quietly disengaged. No fittings, no private previews, no direct lines to decision makers, no unofficial favors, and perhaps most telling of all, no defense from the very institutions that once felt connected, because silence once again becomes the loudest message. And according to those observing closely, that silence isn't accidental, it's aligned. An alignment that traces back to that original moment when the handbag appeared, when the breach was recognized, and when certain individuals chose not to react publicly, but to act privately. And if that's true, then what we're witnessing now isn't fallout, it's outcome. A controlled, measured, irreversible outcome. Because systems like this don't explode, they close, slowly, quietly, completely. And once they do, reopening them isn't a matter of apology or explanation, it's a matter of trust. Trust that, once broken in this world, doesn't get repaired with words, it gets replaced with distance. And that distance is exactly what's becoming visible now. The absence of association, the absence of endorsement, the absence of validation from the very circles that once defined relevance. And without that validation, everything begins to shift. Because in high-level influence, it's not just about being seen. It's about being recognized by the right eyes. And when those eyes turn away, the spotlight doesn't just dim, it disappears. Which brings us back to the question no one is answering directly, but everyone seems to understand. Was this simply a scandal that spiraled out of control? Or was this the moment the system quietly decided to contain, isolate, and ultimately redefine where the boundaries truly lie? Because if the coordination was real, if the silence was intentional, if the withdrawal was aligned, then this wasn't just about protecting a handbag, it was about protecting a hierarchy. And once that hierarchy moves against you, it doesn't chase, it doesn't argue, it doesn't explain. It simply steps back and lets the space close on its own.